My fiancée and my best friend destroyed my business and career, but what I did next made them regret everything. You know that taste? Fried oysters from our menu, seasoned with friends' laughter and South Carolina sunshine. For me, that was the taste of success. Now I know it was just a preview of bitter betrayal. Let me tell you how fast your world can crumble. One week I was Jay Harrison, owner of the hottest restaurant in Charleston. By the following weekend, I was just another cautionary tale with an eviction notice and a broken heart. Mark had been my sous chef for 3 years. I taught him everything: knife skills, flavor profiles, how to handle pressure during rush hour. Hell, I even taught him how to tie his apron properly. This guy couldn't boil water when he started, but I saw potential. I invested in him like he was my own brother. Sarah was different. She wasn't just my girlfriend. She was my partner in every sense. We'd stay up until 2 a.m. planning new menus, dreaming about expanding to Atlanta, maybe even New York someday. She had this way of tasting a dish and knowing exactly what it needed. Just a pinch more salt, maybe some fresh thyme. She was my muse, my anchor, my everything. Looking back, there were signs. Vendor calls that didn't make sense. A missing invoice here. A late delivery there. Sarah would handle the banking runs with unusual frequency, always with perfectly reasonable explanations. Mark started asking oddly specific questions about our supplier contracts and account numbers. But I chalked it up to growing pains, maybe some healthy ambition. Turns out it was something far worse. The morning everything unraveled started normal enough. I was reviewing vendor invoices in my office when my accountant called. Bob's voice sounded weird, strained. He'd been handling my books for 15 years, seen me through the lean startup days and the golden rush of success. When Bob sounds worried, you listen. My heart skipped a beat, then started pounding like someone was throwing needles inside my chest. The words he spoke didn't make sense at first. Account balances, missing transfers, unauthorized withdrawals, systematic drainage over months. I felt the ground disappearing beneath my feet, and that was before I learned about Sarah. See, while I was building our dream restaurant, Mark was perfecting a different recipe entirely: how to systematically forge signatures, redirect payments, and create phantom vendor accounts. The guy I taught to brunoise onions had apparently mastered the art of dicing up trust. For 6 months, they'd been bleeding me dry with surgical precision. And Sarah? Turns out she was his accomplice, in more ways than one. While I was planning our future, she was planning their escape. Every kiss goodnight was rehearsed. Every morning coffee was theater. She played the role of devoted girlfriend so perfectly, while helping Mark drain every account we had. By the time Bob called, they were already gone. Vanished that morning with forged cashier's checks, emptied business accounts, and a 3-month head start I never saw coming. The sheriff showed up at the restaurant during lunch rush, not to arrest anyone, but to serve papers. Nothing kills the appetite like watching a deputy walk through your dining room with foreclosure documents. You want to know what's funny about betrayal? They say love is blind, but business is even blinder. My bank statements were cleaner than a politician's conscience, not because there was no money, but because there simply wasn't any money left. Even my lawyer, good old Bob, who'd seen more bankruptcies than I'd seen dinner services, just sighed and shook his head. The man looked at the forensic accounting report like he was reading a death certificate. Mark had been clever about it. Small amount at first, spread across multiple accounts, disguised as legitimate business expenses. By the time the pattern became clear, they'd extracted nearly everything while leaving just enough operating capital to keep the restaurant running normally, like slowly draining a swimming pool while the swimmers are still enjoying their laps. The legal fees alone would have bankrupted a small country. Turns out, when your business partner systematically embezzles everything while your girlfriend provides inside access, the law doesn't really care about your feelings. They care about facts, evidence, and whether you can pay their retainer fees. I went from owning a $250,000 restaurant to owing twice that in debts, legal fees, and settlement claims. Suppliers wanted payment. Landlords wanted rent. Employees wanted wages. Everyone wanted something I didn't have. Charleston's a small town when it comes to the restaurant business. Word travels faster than gossip at a church potluck. My name went from being synonymous with success to becoming a cautionary tale. Every glance felt loaded with judgment. Every conversation stopped when I walked by. Every whisper behind my back cut deeper than any chef's knife. The industry that had celebrated me as the next big thing suddenly treated me like I had some contagious disease. Nobody wanted to hire the guy who'd been so spectacularly deceived. Nobody wanted to invest in someone who couldn't even keep his own business partner from robbing him blind. Hero to zero in 2 weeks. That's the headline I would have chosen for my autobiography. The debts weren't just numbers on paper. They were living, breathing monsters that choked the life out of everything I'd built, like wearing a corset that tightens every time you try to breathe. In moments like these, you realize reputation is like fine china. You spend years carefully building it, polishing it, protecting it. Then someone comes along and smashes it in seconds. And picking up those pieces? Nearly impossible. Some fragments are so small, they disappear into the cracks of memory, never to be recovered. The only thing left was Grandma Esther's old trailer. She'd left it to me and her 5 years earlier, sitting on a forgotten plot of land near a marsh in rural New England. See, she'd lived in the family house for decades, but that went to my cousin Michael when she passed. A few years before her death, she'd bought this little piece of marsh property and put a trailer on it. Her personal retreat, she called it. Said it was where she wanted to think, to experiment with wild ingredients, to find peace away from family obligations. I'd never even visited the place. It was just this abstract inheritance gathering dust in legal documents. When the creditors finished seizing everything else, my house, my car, my restaurant equipment, that trailer became my last refuge. Like Noah's Ark, except instead of saving animals, it was supposed to save what was left of my dignity. The drive from Charleston to New England took 12 hours in a borrowed pickup truck. Time to think about how spectacularly I'd failed. Miles of watching the landscape change from palmetto trees and Spanish moss to pine forests and stone walls. Every stretch of highway felt like another step away from everything I'd known. New England in late October hits different than South Carolina. The air carries weight, history, mystery, and unfortunately, the distinct aroma of marsh gas. Where Charleston smelled like magnolias and hope, this place smelled like low tide and forgotten dreams. The trailer sat exactly where the property deed said it would, next to a cranberry bog that had seen better decades. Imagine the saddest mobile home you've ever seen, then make it sadder. Aluminum siding streaked with rust. Windows so dirty they looked like cataracts. A front door that hung at an angle that defied both gravity and optimism. I stood there for 20 minutes, just staring. In South Carolina, I'd been the king of cuisine. Here in New England, I was about to become the mosquito monarch of a rusted-out trailer. Though, honestly, the mosquitoes were probably better company than some of my former friends back home. My former luxury kitchen had granite countertops and a view of Charleston Harbor. This place had laminate counters from 1987 and a view of marsh grass that looked like Mother Nature's forgotten homework assignment. But it was mine, and it was free. In a world where everything else cost money I didn't have, free felt like a luxury. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Sunny Carolina, with its endless blue skies and warm hospitality, had been replaced by stern but majestic New England landscapes. Even the air here breathed differently, thick with history, secrets, and that persistent marsh smell that would become my new cologne. That first night, I sat on the trailer's crooked front steps, watching the sun disappear behind a wall of pine trees. The silence was deafening after years of restaurant noise, clattering plates, sizzling pans, orders being called out. Here, the only sounds were frogs complaining about the weather and wind whistling through gaps in the trailer walls. I brought exactly one suitcase, a box of personal items, and about $350 in cash. Everything else was either seized, stolen, or sold to pay debts that seemed to multiply like bacteria in a warm kitchen. Sleep didn't come easy that first week. The trailer had personality. Creaking, settling, making sounds that suggested it was either haunted or slowly collapsing. Probably both. Every night felt like camping, Except camping usually ends after a few days and you go home to your real bed. But this was home now. The locals were polite but distant, the way New Englanders treat most outsiders. They'd nod when they saw me at the general store, maybe comment on the weather, but nobody was rushing to invite the broke guy from the trailer to Sunday dinner. I couldn't blame them. I looked like what I was, a man who'd lost everything and wasn't sure how to start over. My clothes were wrinkled from living out of a suitcase. My hair needed cutting. My confidence needed life support. Days blended together in a haze of unemployment applications, debt consolidation calls, and trying to figure out how to fix a toilet that only flushed when you sweet-talked it in exactly the right tone. But there were traces of Grandma Esther everywhere. A recipe box on the counter, still filled with index cards written in her careful handwriting. Jars of preserved something or other in the pantry, labeled with dates from before Y2K was concerned. Even her apron still hung on a hook by the stove, waiting for hands that would never use it again. Grandma Esther had been legendary in her own quiet way. Not famous like celebrity chefs on TV, but known throughout the county for her preserves, her holiday cakes, her ability to turn simple ingredients into pure magic. She was the kind of cook who never measured anything, but somehow always got it perfect. I remembered summer visits as a kid, watching her work in that tiny kitchen, like it was Carnegie Hall and she was conducting a symphony. The woman could make jam that tasted like bottled sunshine and desserts that made grown adults weep with joy. By the third week, desperation was setting in. Unemployment benefits barely covered utilities, and the trailer's heating system was more suggestion than actual warmth. I needed income, needed purpose, needed something to remind me I was still alive and capable of more than just surviving. That's when I started really cleaning the place. Not just surface cleaning, deep, therapeutic, desperate cleaning. Moving furniture, pulling up loose floorboards, attacking decades of accumulated stuff that previous residents had left behind. The work was exhausting but oddly satisfying. Every bag of trash removed felt like clearing space in my head. Every surface scrubbed clean was a small victory against the chaos my life had become. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect in an old trailer. Outdated magazines, broken furniture, kitchen gadgets that belonged in a museum. But there were also treasures, old photographs, handwritten letters, pieces of family history I'd never known existed. Grandma Esther had apparently been quite the correspondent. Letters from relatives, friends, neighbors, all written in the careful cursive that schools don't teach anymore. Reading them was like finding a window into a different world, where people took time to write real letters about real things. Some were recipes shared between friends. Others were updates about family, weather, local gossip. A few were love letters from Grandpa Henry, written during his brief stint in the Navy. Those made me think about Sarah, about letters I'd never get to write, promises that would never be kept. The physical work helped distract from the emotional work of processing betrayal. Scrubbing floors is therapeutic, when your heart needs scrubbing too. Reorganizing cabinets gives you a sense of control when everything else feels chaotic. But it was while moving an old dresser that things got interesting. The dresser was heavier than it looked, wedged into a corner behind what might have once been called a bedroom. As I wrestled away from the wall, I heard something shift inside. Not the sound of loose change or forgotten jewelry, but something more substantial. The bottom drawer was stuck, swollen from decades of New England humidity. When I finally forced it open, instead of finding old clothes or mothballs, I discovered it had a false bottom, a piece of plywood that didn't quite fit right, with edges that lifted when you knew where to look. My heart started racing. Not the panic racing from earlier disasters, but anticipation racing. Like Christmas morning when you're 8 years old, and you know there's something special waiting under the tree. This wasn't going to be money. I was too experienced with disappointment to expect that kind of luck. But it was something Grandma Esther had hidden. Something important enough to conceal. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. I knelt there for a full minute, just staring at that loose piece of plywood. Part of me wanted to savor the moment before disappointment inevitably arrived. Part of me was scared of what I might find. Or more accurately, scared of what I might not find. The wind outside picked up, rattling the trailer's windows like nature's drum roll. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called across the marsh, its voice carrying all the loneliness I felt inside. But there was something else in that moment, a feeling I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Real, honest-to-goodness hope that maybe, just maybe, rock bottom had a basement, and I was about to find the key to the door back upstairs. I took a deep breath, tasting salt air mixed with pine needles mixed with the mustiness of old secrets. Then I lifted that piece of plywood and discovered that sometimes, when you think you've lost everything, the universe has been saving the best surprise for last. And just when I thought I'd lost all hope, my fingers found something unexpected beneath that rotting board. Beneath that rotting board lay emptiness. My heart started hammering faster. First thought, treasure. Money. How wrong I was about to be. Instead of gold, I found an old wooden box, darkened by time and secrets. When I cracked it open, there weren't any shiny coins waiting for me, just faded, yellowed notebooks. My disappointment was so crushing, I almost threw them right back into that hole. Grandma Esther, even from beyond the grave, you're still playing your mysterious games with me. I was ready to sell my soul for a sandwich at that point, and here I was staring at old papers. Maybe these were recipes for cooking up new debt, or instructions on how to lose everything even faster than I already had. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the scent of old paper mixed with lavender, or the memory of her voice calling from the kitchen. Whatever it was, I found myself sitting down cross-legged on that trailer floor, notebooks in hand, like a kid about to open a comic book. Then I saw her handwriting. Calligraphic, elegant, like embroidery made of words. Recipe titles that read like poetry. Orange Dream, Strawberry Embrace, Summer's Last Kiss. Each letter perfectly formed, the way they used to teach in schools when penmanship actually mattered. Suddenly I was 8 years old again, running into her kitchen where it always smelled like summer and magic. The woman had a gift that went beyond cooking. She was some kind of culinary wizard who could capture entire seasons in mason jars. Grandma Esther didn't just bake pies. She created edible masterpieces that somehow bottled sunshine and stored memories. She wasn't just a cook. She was an alchemist who transformed ordinary fruit into pure nostalgia. Her preserves were legendary throughout the county. Neighbor ladies would argue about whose were better, but everyone secretly knew Grandma Esther was in a league of her own. She was a living legend, and her kitchen was a temple where simple ingredients became something sacred. I remembered church potlucks where people would literally fight over the last jar of her apple cinnamon heaven. The woman could make jam that tasted like childhood itself, and pickles that somehow made you homesick even when you were sitting in your own house. I kept digging through those notebooks, my hands getting steadier as curiosity replaced disappointment. Page after page of recipes written in that perfect script. Blackberry Bliss, Peach Paradise, Apple Autumn, each one detailed like a love letter to ingredients. Some recipes had little notes in the margins, reminders about timing, weather conditions, even which neighbor had requested the recipe. It was like reading someone's culinary diary, complete with successes, failures, and everything in between. Then I found it, a thin notebook with a title written in bold. Sweeping letters, Grandma Esther's Forgotten Delight. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't thought of it in years, maybe decades. But just seeing those words was enough to pull me back to that tiny kitchen and the glow of Christmas lights reflected in her flour-dusted apron. Oh, that dessert! Memory flooded back like a dam bursting. She only made it on Christmas or Thanksgiving, treating it like some kind of sacred ritual. It looked like jelly, but it wasn't just jelly. It was something weightless, sparkling, that melted on your tongue and left an aftertaste of pure summer magic. I could hear her voice in my head, explaining it to curious relatives who always asked for the recipe. This isn't just jelly, she'd say with that knowing smile. This is summer soul, caught in a jar. The secret isn't in the ingredients. It's in the love you cook with. Everyone would nod like they understood. But nobody ever got the recipe. Now I knew why. It wasn't just about protecting family secrets. It was about protecting something that couldn't be replicated without understanding the heart behind it. My heart started racing again, but this time from excitement instead of panic. This wasn't just a recipe. This was a piece of my childhood that had somehow survived everything else falling apart. A connection to simpler times when the biggest worry was whether there'd be enough dessert left for seconds. The recipe itself was unlike anything I had seen in culinary school or my professional kitchen. Measurements that made no scientific sense. Cooking times that seemed random. Instructions that sounded more like poetry than procedure. Yet, somehow, reading it felt like coming home. Like finding a language I'd forgotten I spoke. At the bottom of the box, my fingers found something else. A tiny clay jar, sealed with old-fashioned wax that had hardened into amber-colored stone. Written on it in faded ink, secret ingredient. Next to it lay strange little tools that looked like they belonged to a jeweler or maybe an ancient herbalist. When I carefully broke that wax seal with trembling hands, the air in the trailer suddenly filled with the most incredible aroma. Not just exotic, rare. I caught notes of wild rose, something citrusy, and something else entirely that reminded me of the damp marsh where Grandma spent hours collecting her botanical treasures. The scent was so complex it made my trained chef's nose spin. This wasn't something you could buy at any market, even the fancy ones in Charleston. This was something that had taken decades to perfect, maybe generations. Thanks to my farmer father and years of culinary training, I knew this wasn't just any old spice mix. This was an artisanal blend of wild berries, exotic herbs, and rare flowers. And that's when I remembered Grandpa Henry. The man wasn't just a botanist. He was obsessed with finding rare plants that everyone else had given up for lost. He believed the marshes of New England still harbored species that the scientific community thought were extinct. And he was absolutely right. I remember the stories now, how he discovered that rare wild orchid growing in the deepest part of the marsh. The one that Grandma always mysteriously mentioned but never fully explained. She hadn't just found it. Thanks to Grandpa's knowledge, she'd managed to preserve an entire population in that wetland. This explained everything. The ingredient's uniqueness. Its almost mystical properties. The way that dessert could make grown adults tear up with inexplicable joy. This wasn't just cooking. This was botanical alchemy passed down through generations. Sometimes the most precious treasures aren't hidden in bank vaults. They're tucked away in forgotten corners of nature, passed down through generations of people who understood that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in knowledge, love, and the ability to create joy. I sat there on that trailer floor, holding that tiny jar like it contained liquid gold. In a way, it did. This represented decades of experimentation, love, and scientific curiosity. Two people who'd spent their lives understanding plants and flavors in ways that modern culinary schools never taught. The more I studied those notebooks, the more I realized this wasn't just cooking. It was ancestral wisdom wrapped in recipe form. Grandma Esther and Grandpa Henry had created something truly unique, and somehow it had found its way to me at exactly the moment I needed it most. But the real treasure was still waiting at the bottom of that last notebook. A few sentences written in Grandma's shaky handwriting, like she'd save her most important words for last. This dessert I created with Henry. He was my world, my inspiration. After his death, I couldn't bear to make it anymore. But someday, when someone from our family loses everything yet stays true to goodness, then the time will come. Let them bring back the taste of what we've lost. Let it be not just dessert, but hope itself. My eyes filled with tears. Not the bitter tears I've been crying for weeks, but something different. These were tears of recognition, of connection, of purpose that had been missing from my life for longer than I cared to admit. This wasn't just a recipe. It was a message in a bottle, thrown across the years by someone who'd loved me before I was even born. Grandma Esther had known. Somehow, she'd known that someone in the family would eventually lose everything and need exactly this kind of hope. I was her someone, the one who'd lost it all, but hadn't lost faith in doing good, the one who'd been brought to rock bottom just so I could find this gift waiting at the foundation. It was probably the sweetest present I'd ever received, and it came from beyond the grave with perfect timing, like she'd been watching over me, waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal her secret. I spent the rest of that day reading every word in those notebooks. Each recipe told a story. Each ingredient list revealed another layer of culinary heritage that had taken a lifetime to accumulate. These weren't just cooking instructions. They were love letters to the art of creating joy. The techniques were unlike anything I'd learned in professional kitchens. Modern cooking is all about precision, standardization, repeatability. This was something else entirely. Intuitive cooking, where you felt your way through each step based on how things looked, smelled, tasted in the moment. It scared me and excited me at the same time. After years of cooking professionally, following health codes and standardized recipes, this felt like jumping off a cliff into uncharted territory. But that's exactly what I needed. My old life was gone anyway. My restaurant career was over. My reputation was destroyed. I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by taking this leap of faith. I thought about all those Christmas mornings when Grandma would emerge from her kitchen carrying that magical dessert. The way adults would take one bite and their faces would transform. The way conversations would pause while people savored something they couldn't quite identify but absolutely loved. If I could recreate that feeling, that moment of pure joy, maybe I could rebuild more than just my bank account. Maybe I could rebuild my sense of purpose, my connection to why I'd fallen in love with cooking in the first place. The challenge seemed impossible. How do you recreate something that was part culinary science, part botanical knowledge, part pure intuition? How do you capture the essence of someone's lifetime of wisdom from handwritten notes that barely explain the technical details? But then I remember what Grandma always said. The secret isn't in the ingredients. It's in the love you cook with. Maybe that was the real lesson here. Maybe I'd been approaching cooking all wrong, focusing on techniques and profits instead of the emotional connection that real food creates. This was my chance to cook with my heart again, to remember what it felt like to create something that could make people genuinely happy, not just satisfied or impressed. I carefully repacked everything in that wooden box, treating each notebook like the precious artifact it was. This wasn't just my inheritance. It was my roadmap back to myself, back to the person I'd been before business partnerships and profit margins and betrayal complicated everything. The marsh outside was getting louder as evening approached. Frogs were tuning up for their nightly concert, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the call of a night bird I couldn't identify. But for the first time in weeks, those sounds didn't feel lonely. They felt like a welcome home. Tomorrow, the gloves came off. I'd stop surviving and start creating. I'd begin the process of learning to recreate magic, one failed attempt at a time if necessary. Tonight, I'd just sit with the knowledge that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. That moment marked the turning point. I could surrender to despair, or I could try to honor the gift I'd been given. For Grandma Esther, for Grandpa Henry, for everyone who'd ever put love into their cooking and believed that food could heal more than just hunger. And for myself, the Jay Harrison who was about to discover that sometimes losing everything is just the universe's way of clearing space for something extraordinary. The decision was made. This dessert was my last shot at redemption, my Hail Mary pass with 30 seconds left on the clock. I transformed that cramped trailer into what I generously called a culinary laboratory. Grandpa's old cast-iron stove became my altar of hope. The thing was primitive but reliable, like a pickup truck from the 80s, ugly as sin, but it got the job done. My first attempts were disasters. Complete, unmitigated disasters. My orange dream looked more like orange nightmare. The strawberry embrace came out so wrong you want to run away instead of hug it. I was fighting with those ingredients like they'd personally offended my mother. I found myself talking to the pots and pans like they were my therapy group. Come on, guys. We're supposed to be on the same team here. But nothing worked. Everything I touched turned into expensive compost. After the fifth failed batch, I started wondering if Grandma Esther had been some kind of secret culinary wizard. Her recipes read like science fiction. Measurements that made no sense. Timing that seemed to depend on lunar phases. Instructions that sounded more like poetry than cooking directions. I even started talking to that precious orchid ingredient, begging it to share its secrets. Looking back, I probably looked like a man having a complete breakdown, having heart-to-heart conversations with plant matter in a rusted trailer. But desperate times call for desperate measures. The problem wasn't just the technical challenges. It was everything else fighting against me. My confidence was shot. My hands shook from stress and too much coffee. My bank account was hemorrhaging what little money I had left, and every failed batch felt like another nail in my coffin. But I kept going because what else was I going to do? Go back to Charleston and beg for forgiveness? Apply for jobs at chain restaurants where they'd recognize my name and show me the door? This dessert was my only ticket back to respectability. Week after week, I'd wake up before dawn, study those notebooks like they contained the meaning of life, then spend 14 hours trying to decode what Grandma had really meant when she wrote things like add sweetness until the mixture sings. Then something shifted. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was divine intervention, but after 3 weeks of failures, I finally felt like I was getting close. The mixture stopped fighting me. The flavors started to harmonize instead of competing. That precious orchid ingredient began revealing its secrets. The morning I created my first perfect forgotten delight was nothing short of miraculous. The texture was exactly right. Not quite jelly, not quite pudding, but something that seemed to float on your tongue before dissolving into pure summer magic. I stared at that perfect little serving for 10 minutes before I dared to taste it. When I finally did, tears started rolling down my cheeks. This was it. This was the exact taste from my childhood Christmas mornings, captured in a spoon. I started giving samples to the locals. Their reactions were priceless and told me everything I needed to know. People would take one bite, freeze mid-chew, then their eyes would fill with tears of recognition and joy. This is the taste of my childhood. They'd exclaim, "This is Grandma Esther." These weren't just compliments. These were validations from people who remember the original. Their tears became my most valuable currency, proof that I'd somehow managed to resurrect magic. Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived in town for 70 years, actually grabbed my arm and whispered that she hadn't tasted anything this special since her own grandmother passed away. That's when I knew I wasn't just making dessert. I was creating edible time machines. Of course, success always attracts both friends and enemies. Enter Malcolm Biggs, the most determined food safety inspector in New England history. This man was a living embodiment of bureaucratic misery, seasoned with a healthy dose of personal grudges. Turns out he'd been a rival of Grandpa Henry back in the day, something about competing theories on local plant life. Now he seemed determined to settle old scores by making my life miserable. The man showed up at my trailer with a clipboard, an attitude, and enough regulatory ammunition to shut down a small city. Mr. Harrison, he announced with all the warmth of a tax audit, "Your kitchen doesn't meet any current health standards. This is a trailer. You planning to poison people the same way your debts poison your last business?" I tried explaining that my kitchen was actually a culinary laboratory with enhanced mobility features. He just scowled at me like I'd insulted his mother. "Mobility, you say? I bet you wish you were mobile when your bank account went negative." The man had clearly done his homework on my spectacular fall from grace. Every interaction felt like he was twisting the knife just to watch me squirm. But I'd learned something about enemies during my crash course in losing everything. Some enemies want your money, some want your reputation, and some just want you to suffer because misery loves company and they're swimming in their own unhappiness. Malcolm was definitely the third type, a bitter man who'd found someone to blame for his own disappointments. But not everyone in town was rooting against me. One afternoon, while I was questioning my life choices and wondering if I should just give up, a woman approached my trailer, Evelyn Price. She had energy radiating from her like sunshine, with eyes that sparkled like she knew secrets the rest of us hadn't figured out yet. She owned a local craft coffee shop called Morning on the Marsh, a place that somehow made the middle of nowhere feel like the center of the universe. More importantly, she'd actually tasted Grandma's desserts as a kid, back when her family visited during summers. "That's the same taste," she said, and her whole face lit up like Christmas morning. "I can see the potential here, Jay. More than that, I can see a piece of Grandma Esther in what you're doing. Let's sell this at my place. This is going to be huge." Her words hit me like fresh air after being trapped underground. This wasn't just a business proposition. This was validation from someone who understood what I was trying to accomplish. With Evelyn came not just opportunity, but warmth, support, and the beginning of something that felt suspiciously like hope. She had this way of making everything seem possible. When Malcolm would show up with his clipboard of doom, she'd appear with coffee and common-sense solutions. When I get frustrated with failed batch, she'd remind me that every master chef had disasters in their past. Working with Evelyn felt natural in a way that business partnerships never had before. There was no hidden agenda, no secret resentment, no complicated power dynamics. Just two people who believed in something special and wanted to share it with the world. But my biggest challenge wasn't dealing with difficult inspectors or finding business partners. It was figuring out how to scale a production while maintaining that magical quality that made the dessert special. The secret orchid ingredient was the key, but it wasn't something I could order from a supplier. I had to find it myself, in the same marsh where Grandpa Henry had discovered it decades ago. This meant daily expeditions into wetland that most people avoided because of mosquitoes, mud, and the general inconvenience of trudging through nature. I dove deep into Grandpa's old botanical journals, trying to decode his notes about soil conditions, seasonal timing, and the precise microenvironment where this rare orchid thrived. His handwriting was almost as challenging as Grandma's recipes. Detailed observations written in the careful script of someone who understood that knowledge was precious. I started talking to old-timers who remembered both my grandparents, farmers who'd known them, neighbors who bought their preserves, anyone who might have insights into where exactly those special ingredients came from. These conversations were like archaeological digs through decades of local memory. Everyone had stories about Grandpa's plant hunting expeditions and Grandma's mysterious trips to collect wild ingredients. Slowly, I pieced together a map of their secret locations. My daily marsh expeditions became a kind of meditation, trudging through knee-deep water, scanning for specific plant formations, learning to read the landscape the way my grandfather had. Every day felt like a treasure hunt, where the prize was a continuation of family legacy. The marsh was its own world, complete with wildlife that seemed curious about my daily intrusions. Herons would watch me from a distance like judgmental park rangers. Frogs provided commentary that sounded suspiciously like criticism, and the mosquitoes treated me like an all-you-can-eat buffet. But there was something magical about being out there at dawn, when mist was rising from the water and the whole world felt fresh and full of possibility. This was where my grandparents had walked, where they discovered the ingredients that would eventually save my life. Some days I'd find nothing but mud and disappointment. Other days I'd discover plants that matched Grandpa's descriptions but weren't quite right. The process was teaching me patience in a way that professional kitchens never had. You can't rush nature or force discoveries. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was following a barely visible deer path through the deepest part of the marsh, using Grandpa's journal like a treasure map, when I spotted something that made my heart stop. There, growing in the most inaccessible spot imaginable, was a cluster of the exact orchids described in his notes. Delicate, rare, and seemingly untouched by the decades that had passed since he'd first documented them. The moment was filled with reverence that's hard to describe. Standing in that remote marsh, looking at flowers that my grandfather had discovered and my grandmother had transformed into magic, I felt connected to something much larger than my own problems. "Grandpa, Grandma," I whispered to the morning air, "I get it now. You didn't just leave me a recipe. You left me an entire world." This wasn't just about making dessert. It was about understanding the deep connections between land, family, knowledge, and the kind of love that transcends generations. Everything they'd learned, everything they'd discovered, had been waiting here for someone who needed it desperately enough to come looking. The orchid seemed to glow in the early morning light, like nature's own way of saying you found what you were searching for. I carefully collected what I needed, following Grandpa's sustainable harvesting methods, making sure to leave the population thriving for future discoveries. Walking back through that marsh with my prize, I felt different. Not just successful, but purposeful. This wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about stewardship. I wasn't just trying to rebuild my life. I was carrying forward something precious that deserved to survive and flourish. The sun was fully up by the time I made it back to the trailer, and Evelyn was waiting with coffee and questions about my expedition. When I showed her what I'd found, her smile could have powered the entire state of New England. That evening, I created my best batch yet using the fresh orchid ingredient. The difference was remarkable, not just in flavor, but in the entire experience. This was the real thing, the authentic magic that my grandparents had discovered together. As I sat on my trailer steps that night, watching stars appear over the marsh, I realized something important had shifted. The desperate man who'd arrived here with nothing but debt and heartbreak was becoming someone else. Someone who understood that the most valuable things in life aren't bought and sold. They're discovered, nurtured, and shared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Malcolm would continue his bureaucratic warfare. Production would need to be scaled up carefully. Business plans would need to be developed. But tonight, I was just a man who'd found his family's greatest treasure and discovered it was exactly what the world needed. The real journey was just beginning. What started as desperate survival in a rusty trailer was about to become something nobody could have predicted. Not even me. Within weeks of perfecting that recipe, my forgotten delight had become a full-blown phenomenon. Thanks to Evelyn's network of coffee shops, word spread faster than gossip at a church social. People were driving hours just to taste that same dessert they remembered from childhood. But here's where things got interesting. That secret orchid ingredient didn't just work in the original dessert. It transformed everything it touched. We started experimenting with Grandma's other recipes, adding tiny amounts of the rare orchid essence to her preserves and jams. The results were magical. Our orange dream preserves, strawberry embrace jam, and summer's last kiss fruit butter all carried that same ethereal quality that made people weep with joy. Lines formed outside morning on the marsh regardless of weather, with folks buying both fresh desserts and jars of preserves to take home. We were bottling belonging, pure nostalgia, in mason jars. I watched from behind the coffee counter as grown adults took their first bite and immediately started crying. Happy tears, mind you, the kind that come when something deep inside your soul gets touched by unexpected magic. One afternoon, I overheard a woman sobbing because we'd sold out for the day. Evelyn was trying not to laugh as she whispered to me, "Jay, I think we've created more than just a business here. This is starting to look like a cult." She wasn't wrong. People were making pilgrimages to our little marsh town specifically for dessert. Food bloggers started showing up unannounced. Social media posts went viral with hashtags like #forgotten but not lost and #taste of heaven. The Morning Food Network called. I thought it was a prank. The producer had to convince me 3 times that they actually wanted to feature our operation on nationwide television. When the camera crew arrived, they expected to film some quaint rural story about local preservation techniques. What they found was an operation that defied every assumption about small-town limitations. The segment there wasn't just about food. It was about proving that authentic heritage could outcompete mass-produced everything. Then local television wanted their piece. Channel 8 proposed a human interest story about the bankrupt chef who'd found redemption in his grandmother's recipe. I was terrified of being on camera, convinced they'd make me look like some crazy hermit living in the swamp. But something magical happened when that red light started recording. All my nervousness disappeared, and I just started talking about Grandma Esther, about Grandpa Henry, about finding hope in the most unexpected places. The reporter called it a magical dessert with a secret ingredient that could change everything. He ended the segment saying Jay Harrison has proved that real treasures aren't hidden in gold, but in taste itself. Success, like a perfect dessert, has layers, some sweet, some bitter, but they all combine to create the final flavor. That TV story brought us more business than we could handle, but it also attracted attention we hadn't expected. Dr. Anna Leek contacted me 2 days after the broadcast aired. She was a renowned botanist from the State University, and when I showed her samples of our secret orchid ingredient, her reaction was unforgettable. "This isn't just a rare ingredient," she said, her eyes practically glowing with excitement. "This is a scientific discovery. Do you understand what you're holding? This isn't just a rare orchid. This is a species we thought was extinct. This could revolutionize both medicine and nutrition." Within 2 weeks, we had investment fund representatives knocking down our door. They wanted to finance research, expand production, maybe even develop pharmaceutical applications for the orchid compounds. The numbers they were throwing around made my head spin. We were talking about transforming a trailer-based operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Part of me bristled at the idea. I'd seen what scale could do, dilute meaning, flatten magic. But I also knew that science could help protect what mattered, if we kept the soul intact. But with success came challenges I'd never anticipated. Competitors started emerging from the woodwork, like termites after rain. Big food companies sent representatives trying to buy us out. When that didn't work, they tried other tactics. One morning, I caught someone trying to break into my trailer laboratory. Another time, a woman posing as a customer kept asking suspiciously detailed questions about our ingredients and preparation methods. Industrial espionage over dessert. I never thought I'd see the day. The most ridiculous incident happened when a supposed food blogger accidentally knocked over an entire batch of our strawberry preserves while trying to sneak photos of our setup. The guy was more upset about losing the preserves than getting caught red-handed. Even our would-be spies couldn't resist the food. Evelyn and I dealt with these challenges using intelligence, humor, and most importantly, community support. The locals had adopted our little operation as their own success story, and they weren't about to let outsiders mess with it. We knew we weren't just fighting for a business anymore. We were protecting something irreplaceable, a piece of authentic heritage in a world increasingly filled with artificial everything. Malcolm Biggs, that persistent inspector, couldn't stand watching my transformation from failure to success. He kept showing up with new regulations, finding microscopic violations, generally making life difficult in that special way only career bureaucrats can master. But Evelyn had his number. Every time he'd arrive with his clipboard of doom, she'd find creative ways around his objections, while making him look ridiculous in the process. Jay, she told me one afternoon after his latest visit, the man's just jealous. Maybe we should make him a dessert. Might improve his disposition. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a guy who'd spent decades trying to prove my grandfather wrong about local plant life, and now those same discoveries were making me rich and famous. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. As demand exploded, we faced the challenge of scaling production while maintaining quality. Mass production would kill what made our dessert special, but staying small meant turning away customers who'd driven hundreds of miles for a taste of magic. That's when we decided to do something unprecedented. Instead of expanding through franchises or licensing deals, we created an entirely new model, a botanical farm and culinary education center that could preserve the heritage while sharing the knowledge. We started purchasing land around the marsh, transforming abandoned fishing docks and deteriorating waterfront property into something that had never existed before, a working farm, research laboratory, and cultural center all in one. The transformation of our community was remarkable to witness. Properties that had been worthless for decades suddenly had value, and young people who'd left for bigger cities started coming back to work in our expanding operation. Local farmers found new markets for heritage crops we needed for our expanded recipe collection. The old fishing wharf that had been rotting for 30 years became the foundation for our new facility. Where rusted boats once sat abandoned, we built greenhouses for cultivating rare plants. Where fishermen used amend nets, students now learn about sustainable agriculture and traditional food preservation. The investment partnership we signed focused on research and sustainable expansion rather than quick profits. Dr. Lee's team began studying the unique properties of our orchid species, discovering compounds that could have applications in everything from natural food preservation to pharmaceutical development. But we maintained strict control over the core operation. No artificial ingredients, no mass production, no compromise on the quality that made our product special in the first place. Every batch was still made using Grandma Esther's original methods, with ingredient harvested from our own marsh using Grandpa Henry's sustainable practices. The desserts were served fresh, while our expanded line of preserves and specialty foods all carried that secret orchid essence that made them unforgettable. Technology helped us scale and study, but tradition remained at the heart of everything we created. Evelyn and I had become true partners in every sense. She handled the business expansion, while I focused on product development and quality control. Our relationship had evolved from professional collaboration to something deeper, a shared vision of what food could mean when it carried real love and history. Working together felt effortless in a way my previous partnerships never had. No hidden agendas, no power struggles, no competing egos. Just two people committed to honoring something precious while building something new. The contrast with my experience with Mark and Sarah couldn't have been starker. This was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Trust, mutual respect, and shared excitement about creating something meaningful together. By the end of that year, we were operating a facility that employed 43 people and attracted visitors from around the world. Our signature desserts were being served in high-end restaurants from Boston to San Francisco, while our artisanal preserves found their way into gourmet shops across New England. Culinary students came to intern and learn traditional preservation techniques enhanced by our revolutionary ingredient discovery. But the real measure of success wasn't financial. It was watching a community that had been slowly dying suddenly burst back to life. It was seeing young people excited about careers in agriculture and food science. It was proving that authentic heritage could thrive in the modern world. Media coverage continued growing organically. Travel magazines wrote features about culinary tourism in rural New England. Business schools started using our story as a case study in heritage-based entrepreneurship. But we kept our focus local, making sure growth served the community rather than replacing it. Standing on the deck of our new facility, looking out over the marsh where Grandpa Henry had made his discoveries, I felt a satisfaction that went deeper than anything I'd experienced during my restaurant days in Charleston. This wasn't about rebuilding my life anymore. This was about creating something that could outlast any individual success or failure. We'd built a legacy that honored the past while embracing the future. The old fishing boats were gone, replaced by research vessels studying marsh ecology. The rotting docks had become platforms for sustainable aquaculture. The abandoned buildings now housed laboratories where traditional knowledge met modern science. Success had taught me something important about the difference between building a business and building a legacy. Businesses can be bought, sold, copied, or destroyed. Legacy runs deeper. It becomes part of the community, part of the culture, part of the story that gets passed down through generations. What came out of those jars wasn't just sweet. It was proof that something sacred still had value in a disposable world. We were serving memory with a spoon, bottling hope in mason jars, and proving that the best innovations often come from honoring what came before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and probably new competitors trying to copy what we'd built. But tonight, watching the sun set over our transformed community, I knew we'd created something special that couldn't be replicated or replaced. The real battle for heritage wasn't over, but we'd won the most important victory, proving that authentic tradition could not only survive but thrive in the modern world. 18 months after finding that wooden box under a rotting floorboard, I was officially a millionaire. But these weren't just numbers on a bank statement. This was transformation money, the kind that changes everything it touches. My success hadn't just enriched me personally. It had resurrected an entire community that had been slowly dying for decades. The fishing village that once symbolized my absolute rock bottom had become the symbol of my rebirth, and more importantly, proof that authentic heritage could outcompete corporate everything. Success, I'd learned, isn't about how much you accumulate. It's about how much you can give back. And giving back felt better than any profit margin I'd ever achieved in Charleston. With our foundation established, I started expanding in ways that honored our mission. We opened a weekend farmers market that became the heartbeat of our community, where local growers could sell heritage crops alongside our signature preserves. Every Saturday, the town square that had been empty for years filled with families, music, and the kind of authentic community spirit that big box stores had tried to kill. I established the Esther and Henry Foundation for Botanical Preservation, funding research into endangered plant species throughout New England. Universities started sending graduate students to work with our team, creating a pipeline of young scientists who understood that traditional knowledge and modern research could work together. Our success allowed me to purchase and restore abandoned properties throughout the town, turning them into affordable housing for the families drawn by new opportunities. The same streets that had been lined with boarded windows now hosted bed and breakfast, artisan shops, and small businesses that thrived because we'd proven that authentic experiences still had value. Knowledge, like a good recipe, must be passed down. That's the only way it survives, evolves, and continues bearing fruit. Our educational programs expanded beyond just cooking. We taught sustainable agriculture, traditional craft preservation, and the business skills needed to turn heritage into livelihood. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd lost everything because he trusted the wrong people was now teaching others about building something that couldn't be stolen or replicated. Authentic value rooted in community and tradition. Watching young entrepreneurs launch businesses based on what they'd learned with us felt like the greatest return on investment possible. These weren't just students. They were carriers of something precious, spreading authentic practices to places that had forgotten what real food could taste like. Then came the morning that tested everything I'd learned about forgiveness and moving forward. Mark and Sarah showed up at our facility's front entrance, wearing their most sincere expressions and carrying what they probably thought were convincing apologies. Mark tried to hug me like we were long-lost brothers reuniting after some minor misunderstanding. "Jay," he said with practiced enthusiasm, "I always knew you'd be successful. I just made some calculation errors back then." Big difference between embezzlement and calculation errors. Apparently, Sarah chimed in with her own version of revisionist history. "We missed you so much, Jay. Your cooking, your passion, your soul. Like my soul hadn't been part of what they'd tried to steal along with my money." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Their clumsy attempts at reconciliation were so transparent, I felt like I was watching auditions for the world's worst acting school. For a moment, I actually considered offering them jobs as dishwashers. But then I remembered the risk. They might find a way to embezzle my silverware. The most pathetic part was watching them try to convince me that their betrayal had somehow been good for me. "Look how well you turned out," Mark said, gesturing around like he'd personally orchestrated my success. Like getting stabbed in the back was some kind of motivational technique I should be grateful for. They wanted back in. Not because they cared about me, but because they could smell money and opportunity. Some people never change. They just get better at disguising their true nature. I smiled calmly and listened to their entire performance. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I no longer needed their approval or feared their judgment. My success wasn't about revenge. It was about proving that authentic value always wins over artificial shortcuts. I'd outgrown them completely. They represented shadows from a past that no longer had any power over my present. Standing there in my own facility, surrounded by students who actually respected what we were building, I realized they looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by their own choices. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's strength. The strength to release the past and move towards something better. But forgiveness doesn't mean you have to let toxic people back into your life. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. I politely declined their offers of renewed partnership and wished them well in their future endeavors. Watching them walk away empty-handed, I felt nothing but relief. That chapter was finally, completely closed. My real wealth wasn't measured in dollars anymore. It was measured in restored faith in myself, in Evelyn's genuine partnership that had grown into something beautiful, and in the legacy we were building together. Money was just the tool that let us do the meaningful work. Our relationship had naturally evolved from business collaboration into something deeper. We'd become partners in every sense, sharing not just a vision for the business, but dreams for the future we were creating together. Standing in our Maine teaching kitchen during an evening class, watching local teenagers learn techniques that connected them to their heritage while preparing them for modern careers, I understood what Grandma Esther had really given me. It wasn't just a recipe. It was a blueprint for a life filled with purpose and meaning. These kids weren't just learning to cook. They were discovering that food could be a bridge between past and future, a way to honor tradition while building something new. Their excitement reminded me why this work mattered more than any bank balance. The students came from families that had lived here for generations alongside newcomers drawn by what we'd built. Watching them work together, sharing techniques and stories, proved that authentic community could still flourish in the modern world. I'd learned that the real taste of life isn't just about ingredients. It's about the people surrounding you, the traditions you choose to preserve, and the faith you maintain in your ability to create something good from whatever materials life provides. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what actually matters. Sometimes rock bottom is just a foundation for building something extraordinary. The sweetest taste isn't success itself. It's the taste of rebirth, of second chances, of proving that authentic heritage can thrive in any era. Our marsh, once a symbol of isolation and failure, had become a destination that proved small communities could innovate without losing their souls. Visitors came not just for our products, but for the experience of authenticity in a world increasingly filled with artificial everything. As evenings settled over our transformed community, with lights glowing to restore homes and the sounds of prosperity replacing the silence of abandonment, I realized the story wasn't really ending. It was just beginning a new chapter. Tomorrow would bring new students eager to learn, new discoveries waiting in the marsh, new opportunities to prove that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold, only discovered, nurtured, and shared with others who understand their worth. Grandma Esther and Grandpa Henry hadn't just left me a recipe. They'd left me an entire philosophy about finding treasure in unexpected places, about the patience required to cultivate something meaningful, and about the responsibility that comes with preserving something precious for future generations. Real legacy isn't about what you achieve for yourself. It's about what you create that continues growing long after you're gone. Standing there surrounded by the sounds of community we'd helped bring back to life, I knew we created something that would keep bearing fruit for generations to come. The boy who'd once run to Grandma Esther's kitchen for magical desserts had become a man who could create that same magic for others. And the taste of that transformation, sweet, complex, and deeply satisfying, would linger long after the last spoonful was gone.